already this morning we've been discussing the opportunity of inclusion, the challenge of inclusion, but you found yourself at ground zero of a crisis of inclusion. And so judging from what we read and heard, you played a very hands-on role through what Uber went through this summer. So I'm curious about both, in a room full of people that include corporate directors and deal with corporate directors, about how you worked out how you were going to act to help the company through that period and what you learned.
So it started in February, actually. And now you say it's the summer, but it's longer than the summer. It started in February, the crisis, with a blog post by Susan Fowler about incidents of sexual harassment, mismanagement, and unprofessional behavior in the company. I was the only woman on the board. And a lot of the accusations were of a sexist culture. So I got involved right away. I spoke at the first all hands that we had after the crisis. And I promised that the board would hold management's feet to the fire, would conduct a full investigation. We brought in Eric Holder. I chaired the board subcommittee that oversaw the Holder investigation. And I made a few kind of pronouncements during that first all hands to reassure the 14,000 employees, some of whom were in the San Francisco headquarters, others were watching around the world, that change would be coming. And one of the things that most resonated with people is to address the culture of hypergrowth that, of course, brought Uber to this amazing place it is now to be a $70 billion unicorn, but also had costs for the culture and ultimately costs for the business. And the main cost that went along with the hypergrowth culture was a worshipping of top performers, a cult of top performers. If you're a top performer delivering growth, a lot was forgiven you. I named top performers who misbehaved, brilliant jerks. And, and I announced at that all hands that Uber would become a place of zero tolerance for brilliant jerks. And we actually proved, when the Holder investigation results were announced, when the board unanimously adopted all their recommendations and let go of a total of about 26 people, many of them in senior positions, the message was very clear to the company that we meant business, that we were willing, from the board to the executives across the company, to bring about fundamental changes.
So the brilliant jerks notion, I'm curious about, because while probably everyone would love for their executive team to be brilliant mensches and brilliant women, that there is an important role that brilliant jerks have probably played in the success of many companies. Did you feel a pushback from any quarter about the risk of losing those performers and not having a certain flexibility in what you would tolerate in those
No,
leaders?
because, and this is really the theme of this conference, the world has changed. And what happens now in the culture of a company affects business metrics. It's no longer as if the culture is a nice to have, and then the executives and the CEO can focus on hardcore metrics like quarterly earnings or EBITDA and profitability. The two are very aligned. In fact, on Friday, our new CEO, Dara, sent an email to all employees which sums this up. It was after London announced that it was not going to allow Uber to operate in London, which is a decision we are appealing. But nevertheless, he sent a very important email in which he said that it is clear that what happens in one part of the world has an impact in another part of the world. So when we don't operate with integrity across the world in a global business, this has business implications everywhere. And that Uber is not supposed just to be a great product, but a great company. And that involves building trust in each city we operate in, about 75 cities around the world. And it involves recognizing that our contributions need to be beyond the bottom line.
That example of what happened with London speaks to something that has also come up a number of times already this morning about how companies not only create a certain kind of culture internally, but message it externally, and that many companies may not do as good a job as they would wish in letting their consumers, or for that matter, governments in countries where they operate, know what their culture is. You brought to your crisis management role your portfolio as a media disruptor. What was the role that you played in terms of how Uber needed to change the perception of the company publicly in the outward-facing way, in addition to what you were saying internally at those all-hands meetings?
So first of all, one of the things that we are all discovering is that there is really no distinction between internal and external. Like what I said at the all-hands, or what Travis said at the all-hands, or what our head of HR, Leanne Hornsey, said at the all-hands was on Kara Swisher's blog, I think before we had left the stage. There's really, that distinction is gone, and that's partly what companies are beginning to realize, that what happens inside the company is really what's happening outside the company. You know, the days when brands could hide behind expensive advertising campaigns are gone. And in any company that engages consumers the way Uber does, more and more consumers, especially millennials, want the company to stand for something. They want the company to be aligned with their own values. So that's the other thing we found, and this kind of the irony, because we have now 65 million riders, and they love the product. We want them to also love the company. And that's the journey that Uber is on now, and I think the new CEO is very committed to this journey. One of the things I did, I committed myself when I joined the board to very quickly bring in another woman board member, because anybody here who is the only woman board member, please try and not be the only woman board member. And so I brought in Wan Ling Martello, who is the CEO of Nestle in Asia and Africa, and she's the only woman board member of Alibaba. So she's working on not being the only woman board member of Alibaba. But the data shows that when you get one woman on the board, you are more likely to get a second woman on the board. And now our goal is to get a third woman on the board. And in the same way, bring in more women executives to the leadership team that Dara is restructuring now, and where there are a lot of open positions, in case anybody has any advice for general counsel, CMO, CFO, we are hiring.
One of those private memos that became very public talked about how core values at the company, like ambition and meritocracy, had been weaponized. How does a company protect the value of their values that are essential to their success and to the sense of collaboration and ambition as a company without allowing weaponization? How does a company walk that line?
Well, I think one of the ways is to be really constantly in touch with the employees and surface problems. I think surfacing problems faster is sort of now a key element of a thriving culture. I see culture as becoming the immune system of the company. Like we have the immune system in our body. You know, we're not going to eliminate viruses. In the same way, we're not going to eliminate bad behavior in a company. That would require kind of transforming human nature, and no company has been able to do that yet. So I think what distinguishes a healthy culture from an unhealthy culture is how quickly our problems surfaced. How many processes and structures are in place for employees to surface these problems? How well trained are the managers? One of the problems we had was that 62% of Uber managers were first-time managers. They had never managed before. So they didn't really have the skill set required to be able to manage.
That logically leads me to ask about how it is, because you've had a genius throughout your career for seeing opportunity, seeing white space and moving into it. And in moving to establish Thrive Global, you clearly saw an opportunity in almost medical terms about healing corporate culture. Can you talk a little bit about that transition and how you thought about that?
What I saw, and it's interesting because I also saw it at Uber, is that we are suffering from this delusion, both at the individual and at the corporate level, that in order to succeed, we need to burn out. And all the data, all the modern science shows that this is completely untrue. That in fact, in order to be most productive and most creative, we need to prioritize our own ability to recharge through sleep, through meditation, through pauses, through fly fishing, through golfing, whatever anybody does. That is not a bug of the human operating system, it's a feature. But in my work at Thrive Global, we've traced that delusion to the first industrial revolution, when we began to kind of worship machinery and the efficiency of machinery. And we thought that the way to make human beings more efficient was to minimize downtime. But that's not how human beings become more efficient. And now we're seeing the cost, the casualties. 75% of healthcare costs and healthcare problems are stress-related and preventable. So more and more companies are beginning to address that. And I created Thrive Global both to work with companies like Accenture, like JP Morgan, like Airbnb, to help produce thriving cultures where employees are not burned out in the course of working, which leads to higher attrition, which leads to more mistakes, and show the ROI, show the impact on the bottom line. And then a media platform that addresses consumers directly by bringing together the latest science on the subject and new role models. Because as you know, Nancy, human beings learn through a combination of data and storytelling. So one piece that we had on Thrive Global, for example, that Jeff Bezos wrote for us, went crazy viral because you had Jeff Bezos, an acknowledged leader in his field and many fields, who wrote a piece, and the headline was, "Why my getting 8 hours sleep is good for Amazon shareholders." And his analysis was that he knows that when he's not fully recharged, his decisions are 5 to 20%, he wrote, less good than when he's fully recharged. And of course, the best thing he can give Amazon is his decision making. And then Eric Schmidt wrote a piece last Monday saying a similar thing. And then cultural icons like Selena Gomez wrote about why she does a digital detox. So then all that is both available to consumers, but also to corporations, which makes it more interesting for the employees to feel they're part of a cultural change rather than just having HR telling them to eat their broccoli.
And yet it feels as though that understanding, that insight, and the data that supports it is self-evidently true, because all of us are experiencing what you're talking about in real time, of our own attention spans being constricted and our own ability to focus amidst so much distraction. And yet, as with any number of things that we're talking about today, where the cost of short-termism, the price that a company pays for not paying attention to this evidence, not paying attention to this data, is so significant. And yet it feels as though there are still profound cultural barriers, economic barriers, political barriers that prevent companies from embracing the kind of roadmap that you are laying out.
Absolutely. And that's why role models are so important. I mean, And we want Uber to be such a role model, because at Uber, you can really see the connection between burnt out people acting out. You know, we all have a continuum of behavior, right? I know that when I'm exhausted, I am more reactive, I'm less empathetic, I'm not as creative. I mean, I think we can all remember how we operate when we are running on empty. Now, when you're a 26-year-old engineer or manager, you may do worse than being reactive and not empathetic. And that acting out is at a very high cost to the business. Also, our cultural values included things which we changed on the day we announced the adoption of the Holder recommendations. We also announced changes in our cultural values, which are still ongoing, but the ones we announced on that day were, believe it or not, we had a cultural value which was being always on. Like, being always on is not the way human beings can operate at their best. So we lost that. And then there was a line that said working harder, smarter, longer. We lost longer, because smarter and longer contradict each other. And then we did a kind of a symbolic renaming of the main conference room in the headquarters in San Francisco. It was called the War Room, and we renamed it the Peace Room. Because symbols matter. No, we don't have. That's another interesting thing that you mentioned, which is we talk a lot about making workplaces hospitable to women. And that has to go beyond the numbers. And if you have a workplace which has a couple of ping pong tables, but not a single corner for young mothers to pump milk, it's not hospitable to women. That was the case at Uber. I literally had young women lawyers coming to me and saying, we have to pump milk in the bathroom. That's not acceptable. If you have a place where the only way to bond with your team is at drunken parties, that's not a place hospitable for women. So cultures are becoming more aware that creating a culture where women can thrive goes beyond how many women are you hiring? Are you creating the space where they can really thrive and where they can see themselves growing throughout their careers?
Well, that leaves us with lots to talk about when we reunite as a town hall. But in the meantime, thank you, Arianna, and please all enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.